Good morning, good morning. I can't see you either. Never mind, never mind. I've enjoyed reading these books during the last 24 hours, rather less, because as I was away in Australia, I didn't get all the post I should have done. So last night, and in the small hours this morning, and over breakfast, I've been reading it with great enjoyment. Especially the pieces by, and luckily, by the chaps who are here this morning. David Matthews is always interesting. Lovely books on Tippett and Britain too, and I've enjoyed him very much. The book that contains lots of interviews with Malcolm is absolutely fascinating. The interviews are very, very good, especially those with Christopher Ritchie, Brian Duffel, Murray Schaefer, and Ed L. And he says the most interesting things on his own in some of the articles. For example, he explains who Beckus the Dandybrat is, but in fact, I think Malcolm was the Dandybrat. Reckless and an urchin. Well, isn't that Malcolm? And isn't that Malcolm in his music, especially? Reckless. And taking things to extremes, as John Woolridge points out. He's easily recognizable, easily listenable to, except sometimes when he puts on a rather grim face and the music gets suitably grim. There are marvellous articles too by Gregson and by Bowers and John McCabe. Very, very good. And I now add a few impressions of my memories of Malcolm. I first met him when I joined as a sort of office boy the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and Felix Abrahamian was the concert manager, and he organised lovely dinners, Chinese dinners, with friends and members of the orchestra. Now the LPO at that time, beginning of the war, had to find younger members for the orchestra because so many of their people had been called up. And two of the best were Richard Aidney, marvellous flute player, who could, with a solo, lift the orchestra up by its bootstraps and play much better. And that also applies to Malcolm. Malcolm, I think, was the star of the orchestra. I've been to many rehearsals, many concerts, and I can still actually feel shivers of pleasure and pain when I recall him playing the muted trumpet solo, some of you may know, in Shostakovich 1. Da-dum, da-dee, da-dee-dee, dum, da-dee. It was superb playing, and also Malcolm's playing was the golden tone. At that time, trumpet players in the orchestra, many of them came from the army, and they were cornet players, really, and they made a cornety sound. Corny sound, I thought. George Esdale was a marvellous flute player, but the sound of the trumpet was not what I wanted. And what I wanted was the sound of Ernest Hall, who was first trumpet of the BBC, a wonderful player, and his pupil, Malcolm Arnold. And Malcolm so often had this quality of making the LPO suddenly play in a different sphere, a sphere of excellence and thrilling sounds. Noble sound. I can recall, for example, the beginning of the development section in Romeo and Juliet, when the trumpet leads off, and his playing then was absolutely exhilarating. He was an awkward person in some ways. He was good fun, handsome, bonhomie, but sometimes in an evening there would be 5 minutes of desolation. The mood would suddenly move from B flat or G major or D major into E flat minor or G A flat minor or E flat minor. He could suddenly be turned rather nasty, and that turned out to be part of the double personality that he had. And we suddenly realized one day that he wasn't just a trumpet player, but he was also a composer. And the first 2 works, I think, are the only 2 works that have titles. The Larches. Trees, apparently. I've never seen one. Not knowing. And Beckus the Dandybrat. He also then started writing and earned a lot of money from writing films. And he did eventually over 110, I think it was 113, he said, feature films. Amazing. And those were the days when producers and directors treated composers awfully badly. They made the films, and then they said, right, in 10 days' time, or 12 days' time, or 14 days' time, but really more than 3 weeks, you have to produce the score, and it'll be played and rehearsed and recorded. And Malcolm did this, sometimes sleeping for less than 4 hours a night. It was an amazing industry. And he was married at that time to a lovely girl called Sheila, but Sheila was rather puritanical in a way. She was not quite the right person to countenance Malcolm's binges. I think at home they only had white waste cider, but as soon as he finished a film, with this tremendous effort of working 16 hours a day sometimes, Malcolm would then break loose and go on the binge. At one time, I was managing the IMA, International Musicians Association, which had a house and premises and restaurant and bar in South Audley Street. And part of my job was to get friends and relations and musicians in general to come and perhaps be members. And I can remember the excess of Malcolm when I invited him to lunch. We had a lovely lunch, and he had about 4 dozen oysters to start with, 2 carpet steaks, plenty of cheese, plenty of sweet, plenty of wine, and he ended up on the floor with the waitress. He was, one of his letters is a rather nice one, which is commending Knappertsbusch, Professor Knappertsbusch, and how marvellous he was when he came to the LPO. And the story I remember telling Malcolm, and he enjoyed it, was of Knappertsbusch, who was one time inveigled, possibly by mistake by his agent, to conduct an orchestra called the Bochum Philharmonic Orchestra in the Ruhr, which was not one of the best orchestras. In fact, it was one of the worst. And he did this, and after the concert, the chairman took him out to dinner and said, Professor Knappertsbusch, when was the last time you conducted the Bochum Philharmonic Orchestra? Knappertsbusch said, tonight. Two of Malcolm's pieces that I love very much. Well, I love the little wind quintets and the brass quintets. They are so witty and so marvellously written for the instrument. In fact, that is a hallmark of Malcolm, that it really does suit the instruments that he's writing for, whether it's orchestra, chamber music, or whatever. And he wrote this lovely cantata for us at Dartington on John Clare, another person with a divided mind. Sadly, of course, there was this terrible trouble that he had, mental trouble. I think most of the composers, most of the geniuses in art are the odd ones out. And Malcolm was certainly no exception. And he went to extreme. As John Woolridge says in his very nice wispy little piece at the end of the book, he went to extremes. And also he went to the ends of the orchestra, in a way. He says in one of his articles how he dislikes the wodgy sound in the middle that so many composers use. And most of his music, it has a great amount of music for the extremes, for the piccolos and the basses. And he says somewhere, I love it, I have never written for the cor anglais in my life. That being especially an instrument for the middle compass, middle part of the orchestra. Music for friends. He was always writing music for friends. One day Richard Aidney came to me and said, look, I'm not getting enough work, I'm not getting enough solo work, what should I do? So I said, I'll ask your pal Malcolm Arnold for a concerto. And he did, and he got it, and he played it, and he was successful with it, and he made him money. And years later he asked him for flute concerto. And he got it, and he made money from that, and gave us great pleasure. Scoring, overuse of the middle. He hated that. Being a composer is a lifetime sentence with hard labour, and I think that was certainly true. Another curious thing about it is that after those first two pieces, the Larches and the Beckers, he didn't write music with titles on the whole. It was usually number 1, opus 57, opus whatever it was. And always this great fountain of melody. Some composers, film composers, write very good music, but they can't write a tune. Benny Herman was one of those. Just couldn't write a tune to save his life, or save his job, as it turned out, with Hitchcock. But Malcolm's music is melody, and some people will decry melody and say that they don't need it. Wagner often just doesn't use melody, but uses the notes for his singers of the harmonies. Bach said at one point that he was going to give up writing in his big work. That, I think, is a great shame, because those of you who can remember that wonderful tune in Tintagel, he should have written more and more tunes. But still, Malcolm gave us hundreds and hundreds of tunes, and he's so wonderfully easily recognizable. In later years, things were pretty desperate, as you know. Very typical, but understandable was, one time I met him, and he kissed my hand. He was so pleased to see me, embraced me, kissed my hand. 5 minutes later, he said, "Why don't you off? I don't want to see your face again." I think many of us suffered from that. We were saddened, but we understood the reason why. But I'm going to escape from Northampton after number 8, because I think really number 9, in a way, should not be played. It's empty. Gregson has put his finger on it when he says people have compared it with Mahler 9, but that's a silly comparison, because number 9 of Malcolm Arnold is a composer who is not in control, as he had been so wonderfully well before. I think I've said enough now. Shall I tell any more stories? Well.